Good evening, everyone. This is Cynthia with cynscraftingworld, and welcome to the reading of uh, ah, what am I reading, guys? Um, The Mystery of Choice, Chapter 3. Let me find chapter. Here we go. All right. Ready? They took me at my word and placed a gendarme with a bared saber at the gateway by the hedge. Give me your parole, said poor Durand, and I will let you go where you wish. But I refused and began prowling about the cottage looking for clues. I found lots of things that some people would have considered most important, such as ashes from the Red Admiral's pipe, footprints in a dusty vegetable bin, bottles smelling of Poldu cider, and dust, oh, lots of dust. But I was not an expert, only a stupid everyday amateur. So I defaced the footprints with my thick shooting boots, and I declined to examine the pipe ashes through a microscope, although the Red Admiral's microscope stood on the table close at hand. At last I found what I had been looking for, some long wisps of straw, curiously depressed and flattened in the middle, and I was certain I had found the evidence that would settle Yves Terek for the rest of his life. It was plain as the nose on your face. The straws were sabot straws, flattened where the foot had pressed them, and sticking straight out where they projected beyond the sabot. Now, nobody in St. Gilda's knew straw and sabots except a fisherman who lived near St. Julian, and the straw in his sabots was ordinary yellow wheat straw. This straw, or rather these straws, were from the stalks of red wheat, which only grows inland, and which, everybody in St. Gilda's knew, Yves Terek wore in his sabots. I was perfectly satisfied, and when, 3 hours later, a horse shouting from Banelek Road brought me to the window, I was not surprised to see Yves Terek, bloody, disheveled, hatless, with a strong parasite. Death to the murderer! As he passed my window, I saw great clots of mud in his dusty sabots, from the heels of which projected wisps of red wheat straw. Then I walked back into the Red Admiral's study, determined to find what the microscope should show on the wheat straws. I examined each one very carefully, and then, my eyes aching, I rested my chin on my hand and leaned back in the chair. I had not been as fortunate as some detectives, for there was no evidence that the straws had ever been used in a sabot at all. Furthermore, directly across the hallway stood a carved Breton chest, and now I noticed for the first time that from beneath the closed lid, dozens of similar wheat straws projected, bent exactly as mine were bent by the weight of the lid. I yawned in disgust. It was apparent that I was not cut out for a detective, and I bitterly pondered over the difference between clues in real life and clues in a detective story. After a while I rose, walked over to the chest, and opened the lid. The interior was wadded with the red wheat straws, and on this wadding lay 2 curious glass jars, 2 or 3 small vials, several empty bottles labeled chloroform, a collecting jar of cyanide of potassium, and a book. In a farther corner of the chest were some letters bearing English stamps, and also the torn coverings of 2 parcels, all from England, and all directed to the Red Admiral, under his proper name of Sir Louis Jean Terek, St. Gildas, par Molène Finistère. All these traps I carried over to the desk, shut the lid of the chest, and sat down to read the letters. They were written in commercial French, evidently by an Englishman. Freely translated, the contents of the first letter were as follows. London, June 12, 1894. Dear Monsieur, Your kind favor of the 19th installment received and contents noted. The latest work of the Lepidoptera of England is Blauser's How to Catch British Butterflies and Notes and Tables, and an introduction by Sir Thomas Sniffer. The price of this work in one volume calf is £5 or 125 francs of French money. A post office order will receive our prompt attention. We beg to remain, yours, etc., Fradley and Toomer, 470 Regina Square, London. On the next letter, the next letter was even less interesting. It merely stated that the money had been received and the book would be forwarded. And the third engaged my attention, and I shall quote it in the translation being a free one. Dear Sir, your letter of the 1st of July was duly received, and we at once referred it to Mr. Fradley himself. Mr. Fradley, being much interested in your question, sent your letter to Professor Schweinery of the Berlin Entomological Society, whose note Blauser refers to on page 630, is in his How to Catch British Butterflies. We have just received an answer from Professor Schweinery, which we translate into French. See enclosed slip. Professor Schweinery begs to present to you 2 jars of cythal prepared under his own supervision. We forward the same to you, trusting that you will find everything satisfactory. We remain yours sincerely, Fradley and Toomer. The enclosed slip read as follows. Messrs. Fradley and Toomer, gentlemen, cythaline, a complex hydrocarbon, was first used by Professor Snoot of Antwerp a year ago. I discovered an analogous formula about the same time and named it cythal. I have used it with great success everywhere. It is as certain as a magnet. I beg to present you 3 small jars, and would please to have you forward 2 of them to your correspondent in St. Gilda's with my compliments. Blauser's quotation of mine on page 630 of his glorious work, How to Catch British Butterflies, is correct. Yours, etc., Heinrich Schweinery, Ph.D., D.D., D.S., M.S. When I had finished his letter, I folded it up and put it into my pocket with the others. Then I opened Blauser's valuable work, How to Catch British Butterflies, and turned to page 630. Now, although the Red Admiral could only have acquired the book very recently, and although all the other pages were perfectly clean, this particular page was thumbed black, and heavy pencil marks enclosed a paragraph at the bottom of the page. This is the paragraph. Professor Schweinery says, of the 2 old methods used by collectors for the capture of the swift-winged high-flying apparator iris or purple emperor, the first, which was using a long-handled net, proved successful in 1 in 1,000 times, and the second, placing of bait upon the ground, such as decayed meat, dead cats, rats, etc., was not only disagreeable even for an enthusiastic collector, but also very uncertain. Once in 500 times would the splendid butterfly leave the tops of his favorite oak tree to circle around the fetid bait offered. I have found cythal a perfectly sure bait to draw this beautiful butterfly to the ground, where it can be easily captured. An ounce of cythal placed in a yellow saucer under the oak tree will draw to it every Apatura iris within the radius of 20 miles. So if any collector who possesses a little cythal, even though it be in a sealed bottle in his pocket, if such collector does not find a single Apatura iris fluttering close about him within an hour, let him be satisfied that the Apatura iris does not inhabit his country. When I had finished reading this note, I sat for a long while, thinking hard. Then I examined the 2 jars. They were labeled Cythril. One was full, the other nearly full. The rest must be on the corpse of the Red Admiral, I thought, no matter if it is a corked bottle. I took all the things back to the chest, laid them carefully on the straw, and closed the lid. The gendarme sentinel at the gate saluted me respectfully as I crossed over to the Groix Inn. The inn was surrounded by an excited crowd, and the hallway was choked with gendarmes and peasants. On every side, they greeted me cordially, announcing that the real murderer was caught, but I pushed by them without a word and ran upstairs to find Liz. She opened her door and I knocked, and threw both her arms around my neck. I took her to my breast and kissed her. After a moment, I asked her if she would obey me no matter what I commanded, and she said she would, with a proud humility that touched me. Then go at once to Yvette in St. Julien, I said. Ask her to harness the dog cart and drive you to the convent in Quimperlé. Wait for me there. Will you do this without questioning me, my darling? She raised her face to mine. Kiss me, she said innocently. The next moment she had vanished. I walked deliberately into the Purple Emperor's room and peered into the gauze-covered box, which had held the chrysalis of Apatura iris. It was as I expected. The chrysalis was empty and transparent, and a great crack ran down the middle of its back. But on the netting inside of the box, the magnificent butterfly slowly waved its burnished purple wings, for the chrysalis had given up its silent tenant, the butterfly symbol of immortality. Then a great fear fell upon me. I now know that this was the fear of the Black Priest, but neither then nor for years after did I know about the Black Priest had ever lived on earth. As I bent over the box, I heard a confused murmur outside the house, which ended in a furious shout of "Parricide!" And I heard the gendarmes ride away behind a wagon which rattled sharply on the flinty highway. I went to the window. In the wagon sat Yves Terek, bound and wild-eyed, 2 gendarmes at either side of him, and all around the wagon road mounted gendarmes whose bared sabers scarcely kept the crowd away. "Parricide!" they howled. "Let him die!" I stepped back and opened the gauze-covered box. Very gently but firmly, I took the splendid butterfly by its closed forewings and lifted it unharmed between my thumb and forefinger. Then, holding it concealed behind my back, I went down into the cafe. Of all the crowd that had filled in, shouting for the death of Yves Terek, only 3 persons remained seated in front of a huge empty fireplace. They were the Brigadier Durand, Max Fortin, and Chemist Quimperlé, and the Purple Emperor. The latter looked abashed when I entered, but I paid no attention to him and walked straight to the chemist. "Monsieur Fortin," I said, "do you know much about hydrocarbons?" "They are my specialty," he said, astonished. "Have you ever heard such a thing as Sithal?" "Schweinerie Sithal? Oh, yes, we use it in perfumery." "Good," I said. "Has it an odor?" "No, and yes. One is always aware of its presence, but really nobody can affirm it has an odor. It is curious," he continued, looking at me. "It is very curious you should have asked me that, for all day I have been imagining I detected the presence of Sithal." "Do you imagine so now?" I asked. "Yes, more than ever." I sprang to the front door and tossed out the butterfly. The splendid creature beat the air for a moment, flitted uncertainly hither and thither, and then, to my astonishment, sailed majestically back into the cafe and alighted on the hearthstone. For a moment I was nonplussed, but when my eyes rested on the Purple Emperor, I comprehended in a flash. "Lift that hearthstone," I cried to Brigadier Durand. "Pry it up with your scabbard." The Purple Emperor suddenly fell forward in his chair, his face ghastly white, his jaw loose with terror. "What is Sithal?" I shouted, seizing him by the arm. But he plunged heavily from his chair, face downward on the floor, and at the same moment a cry from the chemist made me turn. There stood the Brigade Durand, one hand supporting the hearthstone, one hand raised in horror. There stood Max Fortin, the chemist, rigid with excitement, and below, in the hollow bed where the hearthstone had rested, lay a crushed mass of bleeding human flesh, from the midst of which stared a cheap glass eye. I seized the Purple Emperor and dragged him to his feet. "Look," I cried, "look at your old friend, the Red Admiral." But he only smiled in a vacant way and rolling his head, muttering, "Bait for butterflies, Scythel. Oh, no, 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 you can't do it, Admiral. D'ye see? I alone, the Purple Emperor. I am alone, the Purple Emperor." And the same carriage that bore me to Quimperlé to claim my bride carried him to Quimper, gagged and bound, a foaming, howling lunatic. This, then, is the story of the Purple Emperor. I might tell you a pleasanter story if I choose, but concerning the fish that I had hold of, whether it was a salmon, a grilse, a sea trout, I may not say, because I have promised Liz, and she promised me, that no power on earth shall wring from our lips the mortifying confession that the fish escaped. Pompeii funèbre. A wind-swept sky, the waste of moorland stretching to the west, the sea low moaning in a strange unrest, a seagull's cry. Washed by the tide, the rocks lie sullen in the waning light. The foam breaks in long strips of hungry white, dissatisfied. Bateman. Pompeii funèbre. In the days when the keepers of the house shall tremble. Okay, 1 second here. Whoa. Okay. When I first saw the sexton, he was standing motionless behind the stone. Presently he moved on again, pausing at times and turning right and left with that nervous jerky motion that always chills me. His path lay across the blighted moss and withered leaves scattered in the moist layers along the bank of the little brown stream, and I, wondering what his errand might be, followed, passing silently over the rotting forest mold. Once or twice he heard me, for I saw him stop short, a blot of black and orange in the somber woods, but he always started on again, hurrying at times as though he might grow impatient. For the sexton that I followed through the November forest was one of those small creatures that God had sent to bury little things that die alone in the world. Undertaker, sexton, mute, and gravedigger in one, this thing robed in black and orange buries all things that die unheeded by the world, and so they call it, this little beetle in black and orange, the sexton. How he hurried! I looked up to the gray sky where ashen branches interlaced, swayed in unfelt winds, and I heard the dry leaves rattle in the treetops and thud of acorns in the mold. A somber bird peered at me from the heap of a brush, then ran pattering over the leaves. The sexton had reached a bit of broken ground and was scuffling over sticks and gullies toward the brown tuft of withered grass above. I dared not tell him, besides I could not bring myself to touch him. He was so horridly absorbed in his errand. I halted for a moment, the eagerness of this live creature to find his dead and handle it. The odor of death and decay in this little forest world where I had waited for spring, when Liz moved among the flowering gorse, singing like a throstle in the wind. All this troubled me, and I lagged behind. The sexton scrambled over the dead grass, raising his seared eyes at every wave of wind. The wind brought sadness with it, the scent of lifeless trees, the vague rustle of gorse buds, yellow and as dry as paper flowers. Along the stream, rotting water plants, scorched and frost-blighted, lay massive above the mud. I saw their pallid stems swaying like worms in listless current. The sextant had reached a moldering stump, and now he seemed undecided. I sat down on the fallen tree, moist and bleached, that crumbled under my touch, leaving a stale odor in the air. Overhead, a crow rose heavily and flapped out into the moorland. The wind rattled the stark blackhorns. A single drop of rain touched my cheek. I looked into the stream for some sign of life. There was nothing, except a shapeless creature that might have been a blind worm, lying belly up on the mud. I touched it with a stick. It was stiff and dead. The wind among the sham paper gorse buds filled the woods with silken rustle. I put my hand and touched a yellow blossom. It felt like an immortelle of a funeral pillow. The sexton had moved on again. Something, perhaps a musty spider's web, had stuck to one leg, and he dragged it as he labored on through the wood. Some little field mouse, torn by a weasel or kestrel, some crushed mole, some tiny dead pile of fur or feather lay not far off, stricken by God or man or brother creature. And the sexton knew it, how God knows. But he knew it, and hurried on to his tryst with the dead. His path lay along the edge of the tidal inlet from the Groix River. I looked down at the gray water through the leafless branches, and I saw a small snake, head raised, swim from the submerged clod of weeds into the shadow of a rock. There was a curlew, too, somewhere in the back swamp, whose dreary, persistent call cursed the silence. I wondered when the sexton would fly, or if he could fly if he chose. It is only when the dead are near, very near, that he creeps. The soiled mess of cobweb will stuck to him, and his progress was impeded by it. Once I saw a small brown and white spider striped like a zebra, running swiftly in his tracks. But the sexton turned and raised his two clubbed fore legs in a horrid, imploring attitude, and that still had something of a menace under it. The spider backed away and sidled under a stone. When anything that is dying, sick or close to death, falls upon the face of the earth, something moves in the blue above, floating like a mote, then another, then others. These specks that grow out of the fathomless azure vault of jeweled flies, they come to waif for death. The sexton also arranges rendezvous with death, but never waits. Death must arrive first. When the heavy clover is ablaze with painted wings, when bees hum and blunder among the white thorn, or pass by like swift singing bullets, the sexton snaps open his black and orange wings and hums across the clover with the bees. Death in a scented garden, the tokens of the plague on a fair young breast, the gray flag of fear in the face of one who reels into the arms of destruction. The sexton scrambling in the lap of spring, folding its sleek wings, unfolding them to ape the buzz of bees, passing over sweet clover tops to the putrid flesh that summons him. These things must be and will wait to the end. The sexton was running now, running fast, trailing the cobweb over twigs and mud. The edge of the wood was near, for I could see the winter wheat, like green scenery in a theater, stretching for miles across the cliffs, crude as painted grass, and as I crept through the brittle forest fringe, I saw a figure lying face down in the wheat, a girl's slender form, limp, motionless. The sexton darted under her breast. Then I threw myself down beside her, crying, "Liz! Liz!" And I cried. The icy wren burst across the moors, and the trees dashed their stark limbs together, till the whole speckled forest tossed and danced, and the wind roared among the cliffs. And through the dance of of death Liz trembled in my arms and sobbed and clung to me, murmuring that the purple emperor was dead. But the wind tore the words from her white lips and flung them out across the sea where the winter lightnings lashed the stark heights of ECBUY. The fear of death was still in my soul, and I raised her from the ground, holding her close. And I saw the sexton just beyond us hurry across the ground to seek shelter under a little dead skylark, stiff-winged, muddy, lying alone in the rain. In the storm above us, a bird hovered, singing through the rain. It passes us twice, still singing, and it passed again. We saw the shadow it cast upon the world as whiter than snow. The messenger. Little gray messenger, robed like painted death. Your robe is dust. Whom do you seek among the lilies and close buds at dusk? Among the lilies and closed buds at dusks, whom do you see, little gray messenger, robed in the awful panoply of painted death? Ooh, I am going to stop there because there's nowhere else to stop in the middle of the chapter. It's very, very long. Well, that was a bit of a twist. I hope you enjoyed that. Until tomorrow, we shall continue reading. Have a good night, everyone.